Aslam, Babyface Nelson, a short man at 5'6", Lester Joseph Gillis, or Gillis, also known as George Nelson, grew up after the turn of the 20th century in the hard Chicago Union Stockyard district. His parents were Belgian immigrants, and he was one of 7 children. They lived on North California Avenue, near Humboldt Park, and their father Joseph worked in the stockyards at a tannery, while their mother Marie, or Mary as she anglicized it, Anglicized, tutored school children in French. Lester was the youngest Gillis child and the smallest boy on the block, a fact that made him the target of bullies. After his parents enrolled him in rigid parochial school, Lester began misbehaving and eventually skipping school. That was parochial, P-A-R-O-C-H-I-A-L. During 1918, his sister Jenny Gillis fell victim to the deadly influenza epidemic and died. Instead of attending the funeral service, held in front room of his home, Lester cowered on his bed, terrified of seeing his sister's lifeless body. Nevertheless, his mother pulled her 9-year-old son out of bed and forced him to look. "See how peaceful your sister looks?" she asked him. From that day forward, Lester expressed dread whenever death was mentioned. His parents sent him off to a boarding school 50 miles away, hoping it would lift him out of his depression. A month later, Lester, dirty and wet from the rain and clutching a kitten, showed up at the front door of his father's tannery. His parents re-enrolled him in the local Catholic school, but Nelson again started skipping classes. During the ensuing years, while he was in his early teens, Lester roamed the streets of Chicago with a gang of underage hoodlums, and by the age of 14 he was an accomplished car thief, according to his FBI file. He was sent to Cook County School for Boys, a reformatory. While there, his father committed suicide and Lester ran away again. He returned to school, but he played hooky most of the time. Finally, Lester dropped out of high school and began hanging out with Halstead Street Boys, neighborhood gang members whom took their name after the central thoroughfare in the neighborhood, which they considered their turf. His early criminal career with the local wannabe thugs included stealing tires, bootlegging and armed robbery. He was nicknamed Babyface because of his youthful appearance, but his demeanor was anything but soft. He was said to hate the nickname, but it stuck to him for the rest of his life. After he was caught stealing cars and taking friends on joyrides, he was convicted of car theft during 1922. A judge sentenced him to 18 months in the Illinois State School for Boys at St. Charles. He arrived at the overcrowded and understaffed reformatory 2 months shy of his 14th birthday. While there, Lester looked up the Roger Toey, the Terrible, and his gang. It was then that Lester changed his name to George Nelson. He didn't stick around, and though Toey, Nelson met the notorious Chicago gangster Al Capone and became an enforcer and thug for the mob. He didn't stick around, and through Toey, Nelson met the notorious Chicago gangster Al Capone and became an enforcer and thug for the mob. However, after Nelson fought with Capone's top ally in New York, Jersey, Anthony Acciatorio, a leader in the Lucchesi crime family, Capone let Nelson go. Even in Al Capone's underworld, Babyface Nelson was too violent and out of control for the mobster. Nelson's reputation grew. It became known that his take on sticking up a bank was to go in guns blazing, and he became the most feared robber of his time. During 1934, Nelson gained even more prominence when he joined up with John Dillinger's gang. Only Dillinger died the same year. Nelson was known to boast about having robbed a bank a day for a month, which was his way of trying to surpass Dillinger's notorious crime record. While that claim was never sustained, Nelson was personally responsible for killing more federal agents than any other criminal during that era. A cold and brutal man, he apparently took pleasure in killing. During 1928, when Nelson was 20, he got to know Helen Warwick, a petite girl of 15 whose immigrant parents had altered their name from Wozniak. He met her at the toy store where she was a shop assistant. Within months, Helen was pregnant, and during October of that year, they were married at the county courthouse. Nelson and his wife were devoted to each other and, in between George's hold-ups, lived a quiet domestic life with their 2 children. In his criminal activity, Nelson was anything but gentle. Richard Lindbergh, author of Return to the Scene of the Crime, wrote that Gillis compensated for his physical limitations with a murderous temper and a willingness to employ a switchblade or a gun without hesitation or remorse for the intended victim. After John Dillinger died, the G-men, as FBI agents were called in those days, bestowed the vacant title of Public Enemy No. 1 upon Nelson. Nelson's reign of terror ended during 1934 during a machine gun battle with 2 FBI agents. On 27 November, in the town of Barrington, Illinois, Nelson engaged agents Herman Hollis and Samuel Cowley in a fierce gunfight. By all accounts, Nelson's attack was motiveless and entirely down to his hatred of lawmen. Nelson, his wife Helen, and criminal associate John Paul Chase were driving down the road when Nelson noticed that there were FBI agents in a car travelling in the opposite direction. He kept a list of FBI and police license plates, such as his loathing of the law. Nelson turned the car around and gave chase. So this is what they do. Nelson turned the car around and gave chase to the vehicle. Once both had stopped, he leaped from the car and fired a Thompson submachine gun at both agents, who returned fire. Reportedly, Nelson made no effort to take cover, simply walking towards the pair. He was shot and injured, but he escaped arrest that day. The following day, however, his body was found lying, swaddled, in a blanket in a ditch next to Cemetery Nile Center, Illinois. It was assumed he had died from the injuries from the gunfight the day before. When the story broke, the New York Times claimed he had been shot 17 times. George Babyface Nelson was dead at the age of 25. He was buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery in River Grove, Illinois, 12 miles from the home he grew up in, near the Union Stockyards. Next is Bonnie and Clyde. Thank you very much for listening.